Alright, so now that we have our layout set up the same way, I can really go through these and kind of show you what they do, what they're used for, why they're here. Maybe you can get some idea as to why I put them where I put them. But let's just go ahead, dive right in. Let's look at these windows. Let's start with the scene window since it's up here in the top left corner. Alright, now this one is one of the most important windows. You're going to be using it a lot, whether you're doing the coding side, whether you're doing the level design. This is a very important window to understand, okay? Now this window shows the entire scene. Now when I say scene, you can think of that as a level in a game, okay? So picture a game, picture some level in that game, and just think of that entire area that has all these different objects and characters and all kinds of power-ups and whatever else is in that game. That is the scene, okay? So what's really important about this to kind of get used to is how to navigate around and look around, okay? So what this allows you to do, it allows you to have that developer's point of view of your game, of the current scene you're working in, and you can look around, go anywhere you want, and you can look anywhere in your game at any point, okay, without restrictions. Now the most important navigation method here is to hold down right click, alright? When you hold down right click, you'll see this little eye pops up where your mouse cursor is, and what you can do, you can move your mouse around and look around just like in any first-person game you would play. Alright? What's also important is you can actually loop the screen, so I can keep moving left, and you'll see once I hit the left side of the screen over here, I can still keep moving left. It's just going to loop my mouse cursor around to the right side. So get used to that for a little bit. Look around, look up, look down. Just kind of get a good view of your area that you're working with, okay? Now another important thing about this is if you're holding down right click, you can also use W, A, S, and D to kind of move your view around, just like again in any other first person game you might have played on PC. Alright, so A will make you strafe left, D will make you strafe right, S will kind of zoom you back, D will kind of, or W will kind of move in. You can also use Q and E to go up and down. Now remember, you have to be holding right click to do all this, okay? If you're not holding right click, these aren't going to do those functions and move your view around. So get comfortable with that for a little bit. Just move around, try looking around the view, see what's going on in different angles. Cool. So before we can go into more depth with this scene window, we need to get some kind of object in our scene, okay? Now an object is basically anything visible in your game. It can also be things that are invisible, okay? So object is basically anything in your game. It could be the terrain you're on, it could be a tree, it could be an enemy, it could be your player, it could be coins, whatever you're putting in your game, each of those things is an object. So we're gonna leave this view for just a little bit. We're gonna leave this window, we'll come right back to it. We're gonna jump on over to the hierarchy, okay? Now the hierarchy is a list of every object in the current scene that you're working on, alright? So this is where you're actually going to create new objects. So what we're going to do, we're going to come up to create in the hierarchy window. And you're going to see all these options here. Now there's different categories. There's 3D ones, 2D ones, effects, lighting, audio. And you can read through all these and look through all the different options you have. But we're just going to work with 3D for right now. Okay? So go into this 3D section and go ahead and pick a basic shape. Pick from one of these first 4 specifically. I'm just going to go ahead and pick cube. Alright. Now what you see here, it created this very simple cube shape in our level or scene. You'll also see that it made the object in the hierarchy, okay? It listed it here. And what you also see is you have main camera, direction light, and cube. Now main camera and direction light were there by default. The main camera just shows what your player is going to see. That's how you control what your player is going to see. The direction light is exactly what it sounds like. It's a light that lights up your level, okay? Now let's look at this cube for a minute. This is the one we just created. This is the object we just created. Now to get some practice navigating around your scene window, I want you to go ahead and try to look at each side of this cube, okay? So you can see I'm kind of going around this side. Look at the bottom. Get some practice with moving around navigating. Remember, I'm holding right click in here, moving around with my mouse, and while I'm holding right click, I'm using W, A, S, D, and Q and E. Those are all my navigation keys. Cool. Let's take a little bit to look around. Make sure you are comfortable with that. Great. Now, this isn't something real important right now, but just know you can go in and out of 2D mode here. 2D mode will just kind of move your view to side view. That's good for 2D development. It can be good for 3D as well. We're just going to leave that off for now. Just be aware that's an option. One other thing I want you to be aware of, and this is something I've seen a lot of people do by accident. I'll tell you, I messed this up one time and I reinstalled Unity maybe 2 times. I spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong, and it was just a simple click that I did, okay? So if you remember before, I mentioned there's a lot of things in Unity that don't look like buttons, but they are buttons. This is an example of that right here. Okay, see, it's PERSP. That stands for perspective. If you click that, it changes to ISO, which is an isometric view. Okay. Now, you've probably seen this view in a lot of games, like the older Sims games. Some more modern games use this, like Bastion. A lot of new games use this type of view. But this isn't the kind of game we're making right now. So just know, if your view feels really weird, it's moving in a very strange way and things look kind of strange, you might be an isometric view, okay? So make sure you're in perspective view when we're messing with this stuff. Now, since we're here in the scene window, let me kind of go over some of the stuff here. Let me go over the different tools you can use, the different things you have available to you to work inside your game. So if you haven't clicked anything else yet, you should have these arrows coming out. If you don't, that's fine. That's because I'm on the move tool, okay? And you can see your tools up here. All right. So we have 5 different tools here, and you'll notice that each one kind of changes what's coming out of our cube. If you still aren't seeing these things here, you might not have your cube selected. So what you're going to do, just verify that you have it selected over here in your hierarchy. Remember, there's a list of all the objects in our scene. And then look at the different, what we call widgets that come up. Or gizmos, I believe that's what they're called. Okay, so let's start with this one right here. Now what you can also use, you can use Q, W, E, R, and T to switch between these tools respectively. So go ahead and mess around with that for a little bit, get comfortable with that. The more hotkeys you can use, the more shortcuts on your keyboard you can use, the faster and more efficient your game development process is going to be. My rule of thumb is the least amount of mouse clicks you can do, the better you're going to be and more efficient you're going to be, okay? So the main ones we're going to be looking at are W, E, and R, okay? These 3 in the middle. Now, the reason I'm not really going over this tool is because what this does, it allows you to left click and pan your screen. You can also do that no matter which tool you're on by just holding down middle click, okay? It'll change your cursor, that little hand. So you can use middle click to do this with any tool. So it's not really necessary to use this tool in any situation really. Another side note, you can use your scroll wheel in and out to zoom in and out. That works as well. But yeah, so we're not really going to use this tool. I've never had a need for it. I can't really see why you ever would, since you can just middle click. I guess if you don't have a mouse with a middle click. So this one right here is your move tool. So what you'll see is when I have this selected, if I can grab these different arrows and I can move this object around, okay? So mess with that for a little bit. You can also move it along a plane. So if I grab this green box, it kind of moves it along the floor. Okay. Now, one thing that might be different with your screen at the moment, that's different from mine, you might not be seeing what's happening in your game window. You might not see that cube there, okay? So what this game window does, it shows exactly what the player is going to see. And you might be thinking, okay, well, what determines what the player is going to see? Because it's certainly not what we're looking at up here, right? You see my game window is not changing no matter where I'm looking up here, okay? Now, what determines that is the main camera. If you look at that, you'll notice it's over there, okay? Now, one thing too, if you don't see your main camera up on your scene window, like say I'm up here and I click this, I don't see it, right? What you can do is you can double click here and it'll take you to any object in your scene, all right? So yeah, the reason you might not be seeing your cube inside your game window is because it might have created your cube in a weird spot, not in front of your camera. We'll get to that later. Don't worry about that right now. We're just focused on the scene window at the moment, okay? So this is your move tool. You can move them around. Now what I want you to look at as well is this little thing up here, okay? This is basically a compass. I want you to think of it as a compass from now on, okay? This basically shows absolute world directions. Think of it as, you know, your north, your south, your west, your east, all that kind of stuff, all right? This is going to show those absolute world directions. And I'll show you something with this in just a second. Let's go ahead over to our rotate tool. That is E on a keyboard. You'll notice instead of arrows, you have circles around your object. Go ahead and move them around. Grab it on different axes. Be careful grabbing in the middle because it'll kind of rotate on all axes at once. It's kind of hard to control. So get used to that. Move it around. So now that you've moved around a little bit, I want you to go back to your move tool. Okay? Now also make sure this says local right here. Okay? It shouldn't say global. It should say local. And I want you to look at mine. Okay? The blue arrow for my cube is facing out this way. Okay? It's going out that way. The blue is the z-axis. That's its forward. Okay? You'll notice that's different from where my world z forward is. Okay? And this brings in the whole local directions as opposed to global directions. All right? And that's why this option was up here. Okay? You can move it along these global directions. I can move it straight north no matter how it's rotated. But what's important to know is that every object can be facing a different way. So, for example, if you are facing towards the east, right? Your forward is east, not north. Okay? Your right is then south. Your back is then west. Your left is then north. Okay? So you got to kind of think of it that way. Everything has its own local direction that it's facing, and that's indicated by this blue arrow. And then there's also the world direction that doesn't change. Okay, that is north up that way. It's very important to understand that. There's a lot of code that works with either global or local direction. You have to kind of distinguish between them to make sure you understand what you're doing and what you need to be doing. Okay, so just be aware of that. Be careful of that. Make sure you know whether this is on local or global, so you know exactly how you're moving your object. All right, so just be aware of that. Be careful about that. So this is your rotate tool. This is your move tool. Now let's look at this one. This is your scale tool, okay? If you grab that white box in the middle, it'll scale everything uniformly, and that is important because you typically don't want to stretch models or sprites in one way because you can really get some distorted imagery with them. But just know you can do this here. So mess around with that for a little bit. Try using all three of these. Just see how you feel about these. Get used to them. Just mess around with these different axes, move it around, do whatever you need to do, okay? Look at it from different sides, get comfortable with your navigation. Great. So again, the scene window lets you see a developer's point of view of the current scene you're working. You can look anywhere, do anything. This is where you're going to modify stuff. This is a very important view, okay? Now, you also see how the hierarchy works in tandem with that. Again, it lists the objects in your scene. It gives you a nice little checklist to say, okay, we have a camera, directional light, and a cube. Now, let's jump over to the inspector. This is another one you've probably noticed has been changing around. You might have noticed some cool things about it as you've been manipulating objects over here. Let's go ahead and look at our cube, all right? So my cube is selected, and let's look over at what we have here, okay? Now what you have is a name up here, you have tag, layer, this is all stuff we'll get into eventually. But for now, I want you to look at these different subsections in here, and you can see them, they're divided by these gray horizontal lines. You can also expand and collapse these with these little arrows right here, okay? So let's go ahead and close them out, and we can kind of look at this, okay? Let's go ahead and collapse these. So we have 4 different sections here: transform, cube, mesh filter, box collider, and mesh render. Each one of these subsections is what we call a component, and that's a very important word you should remember. You can also see you can add components here. And this is a really fun menu to go through. There's all kinds of really cool stuff you can find here. Feel free to go through that on your own time. Just experiment with this stuff, see what happens when you add them. But essentially what a component is, it gives an object some kind of functionality, some kind of capability. It lets the object do something, okay? It lets the object either do something or appear a certain way to the player. So real quickly, I'll kind of touch on these. Transform, this is an important one we'll be using a lot. We'll come back to this in a second. Mesh filter just shows what kind of 3D model you're using. Box collider lets you have collisions for, you know, if you want to touch an object and get a power up or something like that. This is how you would do that, through a collider. Mesh render, this just kind of shows whether how the object displays to the player. Now, an important thing about components is some of these have a checkbox on them. you can check and uncheck them to disable or enable that component completely. So when I uncheck mesh render, it makes it so it can't show up on the screen. Okay, I've removed that functionality of a mesh render, but I haven't deleted this component, so it's there in case I need it again. Okay, so it's kind of like a temporary deletion of functionality on an object. So let's jump back up to the transform. Now, this is an important component. This is going to be on any object you make. Okay, now you see we have 3 values here: position, rotation, and scale. Now, some of these are probably pretty obvious what they are. Position shows its position in the world using an X, Y, Z coordinate system. Okay, that's using a 3-dimensional coordinate system, which we've seen up here. We've seen it over here. And this is saying, hey, where is this object in relation to the 0 point of the world, which is the dead center of the world, okay? So right now, my object is negative 1.216 to the right of my center point, right? X is your horizontal, Y is your vertical, Z is your in and out. I'm 1.561 units above my center point, and I am negative 6.349 back behind the center point, okay? So this just shows where your object is. You can see it visually over here, and you can see it mathematically over here. You'll notice when I move things over here, it does update over there. You can also change values here directly. You can put in hard values here, and it'll change them, and it will update over here as well. One little tip is you can also hover over one of these letters and left click and drag your mouse, and you can kind of do it in small increments of decimals. Just another way to kind of mess with this stuff here. Rotation's the same thing. It's just showing numerically what is happening over here visually. Okay? Works on a 0 to 360 degree system, which we call Euler angles. You see scale, same thing. If it is a scale of 1, it'll be exactly how the model looks by default. Okay? Now, one thing I'm going to suggest to you, and this is a really good habit to get into, is every time you create a new object is to do what I call zero it in. Okay, now what this means is you want to set its position and rotation to all zeros. You don't want to set scale to 0, because if you set something scale to 0, see what happens there? You want your scale to be 1, okay? Now, there's a couple easy ways to do this. One easy way is you can hit the gears up here and do reset, or you can just do reset position or reset rotation, and it basically sets those values back to what they should be by default, okay? Again, I'll show you that again. If I come in here, really mess with this object, scale it, rotate a lot, do all kinds of stuff to it, I can always come back into it, hit this gear up here, and do reset, and that is going to reset everything back to how it should be in a 0 point. Now, what I was referring to earlier, how some of you might not be seeing your cube in your game window, Unity does this thing where if you are over here, I believe what it does is it tries to create an object to where you are looking in the scene window. Okay? So I just happen to be looking way out here, so it put me at this position. It created that object at this position. So even if you do that, you can always just reset it, and then you can double click it to get back there. Okay? Just remember that double click. It's very important. If you double click something in the hierarchy, it's going to take your scene window right to it. Okay? So that's the inspector. An important thing to note about coding, and this is something we'll get into later, is that anything you can change here by clicking around, you can also change through code. And when you start learning what all these things do just by clicking around, experimenting, adding things, taking them away, changing values, you see some really cool stuff happening, and it's really fascinating to understand that core concept that, hey, all this cool stuff I'm changing here in the editor as a developer, I can make that happen during gameplay through coding. Okay, so that's probably going to open up a lot of windows for you guys, give a lot of ideas to you as you're developing your game. All right, just keep that in mind as you are experimenting with this stuff. All right, so I'm gonna leave this thing zeroed in. We're in a nice solid position here. Cool. So let's look at the game window. There's not much to say about this right now until we really start testing our game, but this is where you will be testing your game. And when I say that, I mean you'll actually be playing your game within this window. This will become your gameplay window, okay? And you can do that by clicking play up here. Obviously, we don't really have anything happening in our game yet, so nothing's going to happen when we hit play. But that's how you will test your game as you're developing it, okay? Now, here's an important thing about play mode. I want you to remember this. Now, you'll notice I'm in play mode. I can tell by this being lit up here, right? What's important to understand is when you are in play mode and you make changes to your scene, those changes will revert back when you go out of play mode. So you want to be very conscious and aware of if you are in play mode or not at all times. Because if I were to come in here and make a bunch of changes and say I change all these things, remove components, add some new objects in, okay, once I go out of play mode, all those things I changed are now gone. Okay, I'll show you that one more time. I'm in play mode. Even if I delete this object, go out of play mode, it reverts back, the scene reverts back to how it was before I went into play mode. So just be very conscious of that. Be very aware of that, because I don't want you to have to waste time when you do a whole bunch of stuff, spend 15, 30 minutes inside your hierarchy doing all kinds of cool stuff, and have it all go back because you were in play mode, okay? So just be aware of that. Be conscious of that. Otherwise, in our game windows, not much really to do here. Something we can go ahead to do just to solve future issues we might have, we can go ahead and change this from free aspect to a very common aspect ratio that people use. So we'll go ahead and change this to 16:9. This isn't necessary. It's just something nice to do so that you see what the player is going to end up seeing, because that's the most common aspect ratio. Okay. Otherwise, not much to talk about here right now. I don't use a lot of this stuff, honestly. Maximize on play. If that's highlighted, it'll just fill up your whole screen when you go into play mode. I guess that's one way to make it very obvious that you're in play mode. I tend to keep that off because you do want to be able to look up here and look around at all your stuff while you're testing your game. It's very important. You can mute your audio if your sound's getting annoying to you or something. Otherwise, there's not much to talk about here. You're just going to be playing your game here, okay? Now, the console window. This is going to be your most loved and most hated part of this editor. This is where you're going to see your errors. This is where you're going to see your messages. This is where you're essentially going to see all the output from the code that you're going to be writing, okay? So you're going to get kind of annoyed with the errors at first, but I'll tell you, you want to have errors, okay? I know that sounds crazy, but you basically want to have errors so that you know where you're messing up. All right. If you didn't have errors in your game, you would just ship your game and basically just get terrible reviews because the game didn't work or it crashed or you're having all kinds of bugs, right? You want to know what the issues are before you ship the game. Okay. So you'll kind of learn over time. It's annoying at first, but you'll kind of be almost excited that you're getting errors because you know there's a problem that you can identify now that's not going to happen to the players in the end, right? So this is definitely one we're going to be looking at a lot. We'll learn a lot of stuff in this once we start coding, but just know it's a very important window for us, okay? Now let's look at this project window. This window shows the assets you're going to use to build your game, okay? Now, when I say assets, what I mean is these are actual files on your computer. These are not files on your computer, okay? And I'll be able to show you this in a minute. But these are the building blocks of your game. This is where you're going to keep your sound effects, your 3D models, your sprites, your music, your levels, your terrains, basically everything you use to build your game. It's going to be in here. And then you're going to use those to build scenes. Okay, this is the building blocks of your game. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. But what we'll do now, let's go ahead and save this scene that we've been working on. So you could go up to File, Save Scenes, okay? But I want you to start getting in the habit of using hotkeys and shortcuts, because like I said, rule of thumb, the less mouse you use, the more efficient you're going to be, okay? So getting these habits is not just for this program, but I mean even if you're just using Microsoft Word or writing a report or using any other software, it's good to know these hotkeys that are mostly universal, okay? So I'm going to hit Control S. If you're on a Mac, it's going to be Command S. But it's the same thing. It lets you save. And that's, like I said, this is one universal to pretty much any software you're going to use, okay? So what it's going to do, it's prompting us to save the scene that we've been working in, okay? And you can see it was called Untitled. This is the name of the scene we're working in. Because we never saved this scene. This is just a new scene that started up by default, okay? Now you will see it's automatically saving the location of the save file is automatically in this folder, okay? And we'll take a look at this in a second, but just leave the location where it is. Go ahead and give this a name. I'm just going to call mine test scene. I'm going to hit save, okay? Now what you might have noticed is it created a new object down here in the project window. It actually created this thing called test scene, okay? Now, I don't really like this view how it is right now. I think it's kind of bulky, and I know you can change the zoom view of it. I do use this layout sometimes for when I'm working with multiple objects, but what we're going to do to keep this very simple for now is we're going to change this project window to one column layout, okay? So again, that's right here. One of those things doesn't look like a button, but it actually is. We're going to click this, and right now it's on two column layout. I'm going to go ahead and change this to one column layout, okay? Now, this is a very simple view, especially for starting off. It's good to have this because the other view is just kind of bulky and kind of a lot going on in there, okay? So let's actually make our first folder in here. So I'm going to go to create. You can see there's a lot of options here, but I'm going to go to folder at the very top, okay? Now, one thing, kind of a shortcut for you guys as well, you can also right click in here to get to that create menu. You can also do it in your hierarchy. You can right click here and you have all those options there, okay? Just a quick shortcut for you. Now I'm going to go ahead and rename this folder. This is going to be the folder that's going to hold all of our scenes in there, okay? So to rename, we can hit F2. You just hit return on a Mac. You can also, no, it's not a right click, so you're just going to do that. You can also do like a slow double click where you basically click on it, wait a little bit, click it again, okay? So I'm going to call this scenes. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to drag this scene into that folder, okay? You'll see here, I can expand them, I can collapse them, get a different view of this stuff, okay? Now, one thing I want you to look at, and I'll kind of show you what I meant by how these are files on your computer. Go ahead and right click somewhere in here. It doesn't necessarily matter where. I'm going to go ahead and right click on this test scene, okay? And I'm going to click on Show in Explorer. On a Mac, it might say something like Reveal in Finder. It's the same thing. So I'm going to click this. It's going to bring up a folder. Okay. So what you'll see here, it is a file on our computer. There's actually a scene file called test scene. Now if I navigate a little bit more back, I can see here that's in a folder called assets, all right? And right here, it's in my first game, all right? Now, what's important here is that your Unity project, there's no project file, which a lot of people start looking for when they're like, oh, how do I back up my project? It's just a folder. Your entire Unity project is just a folder, okay? So here's the base folder. It's the name of the game here. A project folder will always have assets, library, project settings, and temp. And you might see this correlation here. If I look in my assets folder, you'll notice that's where that scenes folder is, okay? So what's important to understand is that this folder on your computer, the assets folder, is your project window. Your project window is just reflecting the files within that assets folder, okay? So I mean, if you do rearrange stuff here, it will reflect in the project window. So if I were to come in here and move this over here, come back in here, it did change it, right? So it's just important to understand that kind of correlation there, okay? Now you do want to be very, very careful, because if you delete something from here, it will delete the file permanently. There's no way, as far as I know, to get it back, so please be very careful of that. When you're deleting something from your project window, really, really think about what you're doing, okay? So like, for example, if I just had a folder in here and I just called it trash folder, that is showing here, okay? If I delete that from here, it'll even warn me, delete selected asset, you cannot undo this action. That folder is now gone. Okay, so please be careful of that. And this brings up another important concept, is backing up your project, okay, using version control. Now, backing up your project is very, very important. If you want to back up your project, all you have to do is just back this up. So if you want to make a copy of this folder and put it in a backups folder, or zip it up and send it to yourself online, or put it on Dropbox or Google Drive or OneDrive. There's so many assets available, you guys, with in terms of free cloud storage. So there's no reason you shouldn't be backing up frequently with your project. I try to back up my entire project folder about once a week. If I do some really major work that I want to make sure I have saved and backed up, I might do it twice a week, 3 times a week, depending on how much work I'm doing. But I do have a lot of backups for my games, okay? And that's one way of kind of leaving the problem of deleting stuff from project window. All right. So that's pretty much everything for these windows. Again, it's one of those things where you'll learn more about them as you actually use them in production. So you'll get used to them, but I hope this kind of helped you to feel a little less intimidated by them, because again, I understand this stuff is kind of scary. I understand it's new. I know there's a lot of buttons and stuff, but you'll get good at this, I promise. Just take some time with it. In the meantime, mess around with some of these things, and the next lesson we'll get around to really diving into this code, okay?